Security, remove this man from my meeting before I contact the authorities. Renata Wexford announced this loudly in the marble lobby of the Grand Continental Hotel, aimed at a man in a plain gray shirt who had just extended his hand to her. She studied his clothing, decided it wasn't costly enough for a place like this, and within seconds concluded he had no business being there. Julian Marsh lowered his hand without protest and walked out with his head held high, past phones already recording the moment. What Renata didn't realize was that the man she just had thrown into the street controlled a fund worth billions, had spent 8 months researching her struggling company, and was the last investor on the planet still willing to rescue it. Her company had 11 weeks of cash remaining, and she had just spent 3 minutes alienating the only person capable of extending its life. If you've ever been judged and discarded by someone who never took the time to know you, stay with this story, subscribe, and follow along, because the man Renata Wexford ejected from that lobby was about to teach her the costliest lesson of her career, and he would never need to raise his voice to do it. Morning light poured into the Grand Continental's lobby, casting a warm glow across the marble floor, and Renata Wexford stood exactly where she always stood, at the center of the room. Dressed in a cream suit worth more than most people's monthly rent, her heels striking the floor with practiced confidence, she laughed at something one of her 2 visiting investors said, the same rehearsed laugh she'd used in countless similar rooms throughout her career. She had built her entire existence around spaces like this one, convinced she belonged at their center, never once suspecting that this conviction was itself a form of blindness. At 41, she had been called exceptional so often that the word no longer registered as praise but as an established truth about how the world worked. Her university had told her so. The magazines that featured her had told her so. Her father, who'd amassed a fortune in property development and raised her in a house that carried his name, had reinforced it constantly, teaching her that people fell into 2 categories, those who mattered and those who served, and that someone like her would always belong to the first group. She'd never questioned this belief because it had never once cost her anything. What her 2 investors didn't know, and what Renata worked hard to conceal, was that her company was collapsing. Wexford Technologies had been valued at $800 million barely 2 years before, and now the figures on her balance sheet chilled her whenever she allowed herself to look at them. The company burned through $8 million monthly, and its reserves would last only 11 more weeks. Beyond that lay a word she couldn't bring herself to speak, even privately. She'd approached 23 investors over 8 months, and all 23 had refused her. Now exactly one name remained on her list, belonging to a man she'd never bothered researching. Across the lobby, the glass doors slid open, and a man entered from the bright, cold morning carrying a leather portfolio under his arm. He appeared to be in his late 30s, unhurried, radiating a calm that filled the surrounding space rather than demanding attention, dressed simply in a gray shirt, dark trousers, and unadorned shoes. His name was Julian Marsh, and virtually nothing about his appearance that morning would have revealed his true identity to a stranger. He'd grown up in a neighborhood that people like Renata only glimpsed through car windows on their way somewhere better, raised by a mother juggling 3 jobs, and he'd earned a scholarship and eventually built something the country's largest financial institutions had competed to acquire. Now he managed a fund worth billions and sat on boards whose names people spoke with reverence. Julian had learned something valuable about the spaces he moved through, and it had become a tool he carried everywhere. When dressed expensively, people treated him warmly and told him whatever they assumed he wanted to hear, revealing nothing genuine about themselves. When he dressed plainly as himself, those who genuinely mattered still recognized the person before them, while those who didn't showed him within seconds exactly how they treated anyone they'd already dismissed as unworthy. He'd said as much in multiple interviews, using language he considered clear enough for anyone to understand. He dressed simply deliberately, wanting to discover who respected ideas versus who only respected wealth. Renata had read none of this because she never reviewed the briefings her assistant prepared, considering that beneath her attention. She'd glanced at her calendar entry reading 9 o'clock investor and assumed this investor would feel privileged for the meeting. So when Julian crossed the marble floor, stopped before her, and extended his hand, she was entirely unprepared, having never imagined she'd need to be. Renata Wexford, Julian said. Julian Marsh, we have a 9 o'clock appointment regarding the investment. Thank you for your time. Renata looked at his hand without taking it. She examined the plain shirt and simple shoes, and something in her expression closed like a door as she took a small step backward, the way someone recoils from something unclean. I'm sorry, she said. Who exactly let you in here? The two investors beside her fell silent. Julian kept his hand extended a moment longer, still warm. There may be some confusion, he said. My office confirmed this meeting 3 weeks ago. Feel free to call your assistant. This is a private meeting, Renata said, her voice climbing enough to carry across the marble. For serious investors, not people who wander in off the street believing they can talk their way into a room like this. She looked him over slowly and deliberately, ensuring the two men witnessed her doing so. People like you. The phrase hung in the air. The older investor, a silver-haired man named Henrik Solberg, shifted uncomfortably and murmured that perhaps they should let the gentleman speak. Renata raised a single manicured finger without glancing at him. I don't know what you're attempting here, she said, showing up dressed for a barbecue, but I don't conduct business with people who lie their way into my meetings. Julian lowered his hand. He didn't raise his voice, and his composure, had she paid attention, might have warned her. I'm a managing partner at Marsh Capital, he said. My firm manages billions of dollars. We've been corresponding with your own chief financial officer for months. Renata laughed, an ugly, disbelieving sound. Of course you are, she said, and next you'll claim you sit on Apple's board. She turned toward the security desk and raised her hand as though spotting a thief. Excuse me, can someone assist me here? 2 guards crossed the lobby, one an older man named Theo whose expression plainly revealed how little he wanted any part of this. This man is disrupting a private meeting, Renata told them, pointing at Julian as one might point at litter. He's not on any list. I want him removed from the building. There's no need for an escort, Julian told Theo evenly. I can find my own way out. Oh, he'll be escorted, Renata said. Walk him all the way to the street. I don't want him wandering into some other meeting. That walk across the lobby stretched long, every eye following him, at least one phone recording the entire scene. Julian kept his head level and his pace unhurried. At the door, Theo leaned close. I'm sorry about this, sir, he said quietly. Just doing my job. I know, Julian told him. It's not you. Then he stood on the bright, cold sidewalk, letting his heartbeat settle, feeling the familiar weight in his chest he'd carried since childhood classrooms and countless restaurants and conference rooms, the weight of being judged before speaking a single word. His phone buzzed. It was his chief advisor, Naomi, and he answered, glancing back once through the glass at the woman in the cream suit already laughing again, her guest smoothing her sleeve as though she'd brushed away something distasteful. How did it go? Naomi asked. Cancel the rest of my day, Julian said. Book me on the next flight home. What about the 500 million, the 8 months of work? I just got my answer, Julian told her. It took about 3 minutes. Inside, Renata turned back to her two investors with a brilliant, recovering smile. I'm so sorry about that, she said. You wouldn't believe how many opportunists try crashing meetings like this. Henrik Solberg didn't smile back. Renata, he said, that seemed rather harsh. You have to be firm with people like that, she said, waving it off, otherwise they think they can waste your time. The two men exchanged a glance she missed entirely. We have a flight, Henrik said, and in any case, we told you no last week. We only stopped by out of courtesy. They shook her hand quickly and departed, leaving her alone in the golden lobby she'd been so certain belonged to her. She frowned briefly, watching them leave, then shrugged it off and texted her assistant to delete that man's information from company files, not wanting his kind thinking they could waste her time again. She had no idea his kind represented the only thing standing between her company and complete collapse, and no idea that within 3 hours she would discover exactly who Julian Marsh was, a discovery that would strip away everything she'd spent her life believing she deserved. By 10 o'clock, Renata was back in her office on the 42nd floor, having already forgotten the man in the gray shirt. A board call loomed in 20 minutes, her company hemorrhaged money beneath her, and the small unpleasantness in the lobby had filed itself away alongside every other moment that had briefly inconvenienced her. Through floor-to-ceiling windows, the bay stretched blue and indifferent, and Renata regarded it as she always did, as something belonging to the view from her office, which belonged to her. Her assistant knocked and entered without quite waiting for permission, unusual enough to make Renata look up. Priya Kes didn't startle easily, but that morning her face had gone pale as paper, and she carried her tablet the way someone holds something they wish they weren't holding. "I need to ask about the man from the hotel this morning," Priya said, the one security escorted out. "Make it quick," Renata said, already turning back to her screen. "I've got the board in 20 minutes. Did you research him before the meeting?" Something in her careful phrasing made cold dread gather in Renata's stomach before she understood why. "Of course I didn't," Renata said. "I don't search every person who crashes my meetings." Priya set the tablet on the desk, turned it toward Renata, and stepped back. "That's Julian Marsh," she said quietly, "from Marsh Capital." It was a magazine profile featuring a full photograph, and the photograph showed the man from the lobby, the same calm face, the plain shirt she'd sneered at, worn deliberately in a portrait seen by more people than Renata would meet in her lifetime. Her eyes moved to the figures beside it, and the words swam before snapping into terrible focus. A fund worth billions, a ranking she recognized because she'd spent her life wanting a place on that exact list, board seats at companies whose names she invoked with reverence. "Tell me this is a different Julian Marsh," Renata said, her voice hoarse, some other man sharing the name. "It isn't," Priya said, scrolling gently to reveal more photographs, Julian alongside instantly recognizable faces, Julian speaking at a mountain conference where the world's powerful gathered every winter. In every image, he wore the same plain clothing from that morning. "The meeting was confirmed 3 weeks ago," Priya said. "I have the emails. He flew across the country to discuss the investment. $500 million. The figure struck Renata's chest like a bell, because 500 million represented the difference between 11 weeks and an actual future, between bankruptcy and everything she'd built, and she'd thrown it out of a hotel lobby with her own hands while a stranger recorded the entire scene. She stood so abruptly her chair rolled back and struck the window, though she didn't notice. She found his number among the contacts she'd ordered deleted that very morning, her fingers trembling so badly she had to wipe them on her skirt before the call connected. It rang once, twice, a third time, then his voicemail delivered the same calm voice inviting her to leave a message. "Mr. Marsh, this is Renata Wexford," she said. "I believe there was a serious misunderstanding this morning. I would be honored to reschedule at your earliest convenience. Please return my call." She hung up and called again, reaching voicemail once more, and this time couldn't force herself to speak. She summoned her chief financial officer, and Owen Talbot arrived 3 minutes later carrying coffee and a folder of quarterly reports. She turned the tablet toward him wordlessly and watched his expression travel from confusion to recognition to a horror that deepened her own dread further, watching coffee tilt unnoticed from his hand onto the reports. "Please tell me you didn't have Julian Marsh removed from a building this morning," Owen said. "I didn't know who he was," Renata said. "He showed up dressed like a student." "He's known for that," Owen said, setting the ruined reports down. "He wrote about it in a major financial publication. He never wears a suit. That's the entire point. Everyone in this industry knows it. Can we fix this? Marsh Capital was our final option, Renata. 23 firms have already refused us. He showed interest at all because he spent 8 months studying our technology and came to believe in it." Owen looked up from his phone. "And here's what you need to understand. He doesn't invest in presentations. He invests in people, in how someone treats those they believe can offer them nothing. He said as much in every interview he's given. Renata tried the number twice more while Owen stood there, reaching voicemail both times without leaving a message. She composed an email instead, fingers unsteady, an apology disguised as a scheduling error, a hectic morning, warmest regards, and hit send, the small sound feeling unbearably final. Owen was still scrolling when his expression changed, and he turned his phone toward her. Solberg posted something, he said. It named no one but didn't need to, describing a shocking display of unprofessionalism witnessed that morning, stating that how someone treats others reveals everything about their character, already shared hundreds of times. As Renata watched the number climb, her phone rang and she flinched, nearly dropping it, but it wasn't Julian. It was Gregory Whitfield, chairman of her board, his voice colder than she'd ever heard it. I just finished a call with one of the men from that lobby, Gregory said. Tell me it isn't true. Tell me you didn't refuse to shake a man's hand and call security on him. Tell me that man wasn't Julian Marsh. Gregory, I can explain. Do you understand what you've done? Gregory said. We need $500 million to survive. Marsh was our last remaining door, and you slammed it publicly on the one man in this industry who never gives second chances to people who reveal their true character. The line went dead. Renata tried Julian again, reaching voicemail again, and this time didn't attempt speech. She wrote a second email, then a third, each shedding more pretense than the last, each admitting a little more truth. Noon arrived without response. 1 o'clock, no answer. By 2, her phone rang constantly with other numbers, board members, investors, her own public relations firm, and she stopped answering any of them, sitting in her corner office with the beautiful, indifferent bay behind her, feeling the foundation of her life beginning to crumble. At some point during that long afternoon, unable to stop herself, she began reading about him, not balance sheets now but the man himself, his interviews, his words. This became the detail that would haunt her longest, longer than the lost money, longer than the calls she couldn't bring herself to answer, because as she read, she understood that Julian Marsh had told her exactly what would happen years before it occurred, in language plain enough for anyone to grasp. He'd said in a 2-year-old profile that he dressed simply on purpose to determine whether people respected ideas or wallets, that it functioned as a filter, and that those who saw past the plain shirt were the only ones worth working with. He'd said elsewhere that the worst prejudice wasn't the loud, obvious kind but the thousands of small, quiet moments where someone decides you don't belong before you've opened your mouth. She read that line 3 times. She had been one of those moments. She'd walked into it with eyes wide open and certainty intact, failing a test she hadn't even realized she was taking, in front of witnesses, with a phone recording every second. A more recent interview had him stating, without heat or self-pity, simply as fact, that he'd been mistaken for kitchen staff, drivers, and security more times than he could count, and that each time revealed something true about the person making the mistake. Renata sat with that for a long time, knowing exactly what he'd learned about her. She closed the laptop and buried her head in her hands, in the office that had become her entire identity on the 42nd floor she'd been so proud of, understanding now the shape of what had happened, and it was worse than a mistake. A mistake could be explained, smoothed over with an apology and rescheduled meeting. But this hadn't been a mistake. She'd looked at a plainly dressed man and dismissed him without a second's thought, the dismissal emerging from somewhere so deep and automatic she hadn't even felt herself do it. Julian Marsh hadn't misjudged her at all. He'd seen her with perfect clarity, and now she was beginning to understand that everyone else would too. Outside her windows, afternoon light lengthened and turned gold across the bay, beautiful in a way that felt almost insulting, and Renata Wexford sat alone in the wreckage of an ordinary morning, waiting for a call that wouldn't come from a man who'd already delivered his answer, needing only 3 minutes and a plain gray shirt to give it. By evening, the story had taken on a life of its own, no longer requiring Renata's participation. A technology publication ran a piece sourced to someone familiar with the situation, containing all the details, the lobby, the guards, the refused handshake, and though naming no witness, it didn't need to. By sunset, the incident had stopped being something that happened to Renata privately, it had become something the entire industry watched, and the industry, she was learning, had opinions. The consequences didn't arrive as a single blow but the way water finds cracks in a foundation, everywhere at once, from directions she hadn't thought to defend. 2 other boards where she served sent careful, regretful notes suggesting perhaps this was a season for stepping back. A spring conference quietly removed her name from its speaker list. None of it was cruel, all of it was final. None of it, she understood, was being inflicted by Julian Marsh, who hadn't spoken a single public word, who'd simply walked out of a lobby and let her own conduct handle the rest. That was what she couldn't get past during the long, sleepless night that followed. There was no one to fight. Had Julian retaliated, gone to the press, said one vengeful word, she could have painted him as the villain and herself as an overreaction's victim, a story she knew how to tell. But he'd done nothing, absorbing the insult without flinching and walking away, and every consequence now crashing down on her was simply the gravity of her own actions becoming visible at last. By morning, she'd made the only decision remaining that wasn't surrender, to go to him directly, not call, not email, having already done both to the point of humiliation, receiving no response to either. She flew across the country on the first available flight, still wearing yesterday's cream suit, unable to think clearly enough to pack anything else. She took a car to the glass tower housing Marsh Capital's offices, walked into a lobby of white marble echoing her heels, and asked to see him. The young woman at the front desk was polite and unmovable. "Mr. Marsh sees people by appointment," she said. "Do you have one?" "No," Renata said, "but it's urgent. I only need 5 minutes. I flew across the country." The young woman made a quiet call, listened, and hung up. "I'm sorry," she said, "Mr. Marsh is in meetings all day." "Then I'll wait," Renata said, and she waited. She waited through the morning as employees passed, glanced, and looked away. She waited through lunch returns, laughter dying when people recognized the woman from the story sitting alone in the lobby. She waited past dignity, then past caring about it, 3 hours and more, until the arithmetic became something she couldn't stop turning over. She'd needed 3 minutes to decide Julian Marsh didn't deserve to stand in her lobby. She'd now spent over 3 hours in his, and the distance between those numbers represented everything she'd failed to understand about the world. It was past 1 in the afternoon when the young woman returned. "Mr. Marsh will give you 15 minutes, she said. "There's a conference room on the 4th floor." Julian was already there in a simple button-down and jeans, not standing, not offering his hand, gesturing to the chair across the table without warmth or cruelty, only level attention harder to sit under than either would have been. "Mr. Marsh," Renata began, "I came here to—" Julian lifted one hand. "Before you apologize," he said, "I want to make one thing clear, because you keep framing this as though the problem is that you didn't know who I was." Renata's mouth stayed open with nothing emerging. "The problem was never that you didn't know my net worth," Julian said. "The problem is that you looked at a man in a plain shirt and decided, before I said a word, that he didn't belong in the room. You refused my hand. You called security. You had me removed in front of 50 people." He folded his hands on the table, his voice never rising, which somehow made each word land harder. "If I'd been a 60-year-old man in an expensive suit, would you have done any of that? Would you have looked me over and called me a liar? Would you have had me thrown into the street?" Renata, who'd spent a lifetime performing certainty, found she couldn't perform anything at all. "No," she said, barely audible across the small table. "No, I wouldn't have." "That's the problem," Julian said. Not mistaken identity, not a hectic morning. Tears came then, and Renata didn't wipe them, because wiping them would have been performance too, and she had none left. "You're right," she said, "and I'm ashamed. I didn't come to explain myself because there's no explanation. I came to ask for something I have no right to ask." She made herself hold his gaze. My company employs 3,000 people who did nothing wrong. They'll lose their jobs if it collapses. If you say no, I deserve it, but they don't. Julian studied her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression, though not softening into forgiveness. You sat in my lobby for over 3 hours, he said. Yes. Yesterday morning, you had me removed from yours in 3 minutes. He let that settle. It's interesting how a person's sense of who's worth waiting for changes when they need something. Renata flinched, admitting she knew. I'll invest, Julian said, and Renata's breath caught as he raised his hand again before she could speak. Don't thank me yet, not until you've heard the conditions. He slid a single sheet of paper across the table. She read it, her hands trembling again with each line, a public acknowledgement in her own words of exactly what she'd done, stated plainly without the softening language of misunderstanding, an independent audit of her company's culture. From top to bottom, made genuine rather than buried, a reconstructed board no longer resembling a portrait of a single type of person, a significant donation from her personal funds, not the company's, to organizations opening doors for people her industry routinely excluded, months of sustained work with a coach, the genuinely uncomfortable kind, quarterly reports on everything, and her own transition out of the chief executive role to make room for someone the company should have elevated. Long ago. She looked up from the page. This meant the end of the person she'd spent 41 years being, her title, her pride, the identity built on certainty that she belonged at every room center. I agree, she said. Don't thank me, Julian said again. I want you absolutely clear on this, because it matters. I'm not doing this for you. I'm doing it for the 3,000 people who work for you, who had no say in how you treated a stranger in that lobby. He leaned back. And I'm doing it for everyone who gets looked at and dismissed before speaking a word, the ones who don't run billion-dollar funds, who can't fly across the country demanding meetings, who simply absorb it repeatedly and are expected to keep absorbing it silently. Most never receive an apology. Most never get a room like this, or a sheet of paper, or a second chance. You're getting one because 3,000 people stand behind you, and you happen to be holding the door. Don't mistake it for grace. Renata nodded and stood, her legs not entirely feeling her own. At the door, she stopped, needing to ask. Why, she said, if you believe all this, why trust I'll actually do the work instead of performing it and walking away? Julian looked at her. I don't, he said, not yet. Trust isn't handed across a table in exchange for a signature. It's earned slowly, in the only currency I've ever respected, which isn't words. It's what a person does when they believe the test is finally over. He let a beat pass. And the test is never over, Miss Wexford. That's what people like you always get wrong. The press conference happened 2 days later in Wexford Technology's largest room, arranged with nothing designed to flatter her. No makeup artist smoothed her face that morning. No public relations team polished her words into something landing softly. Renata had written the statement herself at 4 a.m, then rewritten it because the first version still contained softening language, phrases letting her hide, and Julian's sheet of paper had demanded plain truth. She stood at the podium under the lights holding a single page, no armor of any kind. 3 days ago, she said, her voice shaking, and she let it, I committed an act of racial profiling. I refused to shake the hand of a man who traveled across the country to meet with me. I judged him by his clothing and skin color rather than a single fact about who he actually was. I called security on him. I had him removed from a building in front of 50 people. She forced herself to continue. There's no excuse. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This wasn't a stressful morning. It was prejudice, mine, and it caused real harm to someone who'd done nothing but offer me his hand. Cameras clicked and flashed. She read the commitments from the page, the audit, the reconstructed board, the personal donation, the bias training, then looked up, forcing herself to meet the room's collective gaze. I hope my failure serves as a lesson to someone, she said, because business success means nothing if you fail the simplest test of basic human decency. Questions came rapidly then, none gentle, and she didn't ask for gentleness. "Will you resign as chief executive?" a reporter near the front called out. "I'll be stepping down within the month," Renata said. "Do you believe an apology suffices?" "No, words never suffice. Only what follows will mean anything, and I intend spending the rest of my career proving I've learned this." Then a reporter near the back asked the question mattering more than all others combined. "Would you face any consequences if the man in the lobby hadn't happened to be a billionaire?" Renata stood under the lights and gave the most honest answer she'd ever offered publicly. "No," she said. "Had Julian Marsh been an ordinary man in ordinary clothes, no one would have recorded it. No board would have called. No story would have run. I'd have returned to my office and forgotten his face by lunch, the way I've forgotten hundreds of faces before his. I'm facing consequences only because the man I wronged had power. The people I wronged before him, those without power, simply absorbed it silently." Her voice performed nothing. "That's the real problem. It's bigger than me, and it doesn't get solved by punishing one woman at a podium." The room fell quiet differently after that, because she'd said what the story itself didn't want said, turning it from a satisfying spectacle of a bad person facing consequences into something harder, truer, less comfortable to witness. She walked off stage on legs that didn't feel like hers. By evening, headlines were everywhere, none kind, and she expected none to be. The board convened that night in a session she wasn't invited to, and at 8 o'clock her phone rang, Gregory Whitfield calling. "The vote's done," Gregory said, "you're removed as chief executive, effective immediately. You'll retain a non-executive board seat for 6 months while we determine next steps." "Who takes the company?" Renata asked. A pause followed. "Dr. Marcus Odell." The name landed with unexpected weight, her own chief operating officer for 3 years, the quiet, careful, brilliant man she'd passed over twice for exactly this role because he didn't command a room the way she did, because he listened more than he spoke. She'd mistaken his steadiness for lack of ambition, the same way she'd mistaken a plain gray shirt for lack of worth. "He'll be good," Renata said quietly, and meant it. "He'd better be," Gregory said, "you put us all in an impossible position." The line went dead. Consequences kept arriving in the following days and weeks, real, heavy, and continuous even as the news cycle moved on. Other boards asked her to resign in earnest, and she resigned. Speaking invitations that once filled her calendar simply stopped arriving. 2 organizations she tried joining afterward declined without explanation, none needed. At a fundraiser she'd attended for years, conversation dropped when she entered, people suddenly remembering other places they needed to be, and she left early, driving home through familiar streets that looked identical yet felt entirely different. She wasn't exactly being destroyed, she was finally being seen, and the seeing constituted a kind of exile she'd spent her entire life inflicting on others without ever feeling it herself. But the company didn't die, and that was what mattered, the reason any of this had happened at all. Marsh Capital's investment closed at $500 million, and the figure that once chilled Renata's hand stopped functioning as a countdown to the end. 3,000 people kept their jobs, most never knowing how close they'd come to losing them, or that their futures had hinged for a few days on whether a woman on the 42nd floor could be made to recognize what she'd done. Julian released a brief statement through his office when the deal closed, mentioning Renata by name nowhere within it. "Real change requires more than words," it read. "We'll be watching closely to see whether these commitments are honored. This was never about one incident. It's about the 1,000 quiet ones that never make the news." Marcus Odell took over the company, and under him it slowly became something Renata had never possessed the vision to build. The independent audit returned findings that were difficult, patterns she'd overseen and never recognized, capable people who'd left because they'd understood long before she did that the environment wasn't built for them. Marcus didn't bury the report. He stood before the entire company and read it aloud, the hard numbers and harder ones. "This is what we were," he told. then clicked to the next slide. Now let me show you what we're becoming instead. The changes weren't cosmetic, they were structural and real, and within a year the company wasn't merely surviving but stronger than it had been under her, because it turned out many talented people had been waiting a long time for permission to do their best work, and someone had finally granted it. The effect rippled outward as true things tend to do. Other companies in the industry, watching, began conducting their own audits, some sincerely, some because their own employees demanded it, and the standard for what a leader could get away with shifted several degrees in a direction it had needed to shift for a long time. A business school wrote the entire affair into a case study assigned to students who would someday run companies of their own, and the lesson at its center wasn't simply avoid cruelty in a lobby, but something larger, that how a person treats those they believe can offer them nothing represents the truest measure of their character. Through all this, Julian Marsh remained unchanged, and Renata came to understand over that long year that this was precisely the point. He didn't take a victory lap. He didn't grant the interviews he could have. He continued dressing exactly as he always had, running the same quiet test on everyone he encountered, because the world hadn't changed even if one small corner of it had. He expanded the fund he'd built for founders who'd come up the way he had, from the same overlooked neighborhoods the world drove past en route to somewhere wealthier, wanting no credit for any of it, because credit had never been what he sought. Renata did the work, and this surprised the people who'd written her off, surprising her most of all. She attended coaching sessions, the genuinely uncomfortable kind, sitting in rooms where she wasn't the most important person and didn't get to be. "You've been in this industry 20 years, her coach said in one session. "How is this the first time you're confronting any of this?" "I thought voting the right way was enough," Renata said, "donating to the right causes, I thought that made me one of the good ones." "Those are the easy things," the coach told her without cruelty, "the passive things. What happened in that lobby wasn't a failure of your politics. It was something much deeper and closer to the bone. The process was slow. It didn't make her heroic. She wasn't redeemed, and she knew better than to expect it, having learned redemption wasn't a destination one arrived at but a practice maintained or abandoned for the rest of one's life. She made the donation, real money that cost her, and she meant it to cost her. She sent quarterly reports to Julian's office, and for a long time he didn't respond, and she didn't expect him to, understanding finally she wasn't owed a response, that she was earning something impossible to demand. Eventually she taught a single seminar at the university where she'd once been the type of alumna invited to deliver triumphant commencement addresses, and the seminar concerned bias in leadership, taught not as an expert who'd solved the problem but as a cautionary example who'd lived it. She stood before young people who would someday run their own companies and told them what she wished someone had made her understand before it cost her everything. "Examine yourselves," she told them, "before your assumptions cost someone else. Your certainty isn't the same thing as being right." 1 year after that lobby morning, Wexford Technologies held its annual investor summit in the same Grand Continental Hotel, the same marble room where a man in a plain grey shirt had once been walked to the street, but everything else had changed. The room held more people and more varieties of faces, carrying an ease absent before. Julian Marsh walked through the entrance at 9 o'clock in a charcoal polo and pressed slacks, portfolio under his arm, and this time Renata waited at the door, not to charm an investor, not to work the room, but simply to meet him. "Mr. Marsh," she said, extending her hand, "thank you for coming." Julian looked at it for a moment, then shook it firmly and evenly. "Thank you for the invitation, Renata." First names, earned across a year of quarterly reports, difficult conversations, and slow proof never freely given. They walked into the summit together, later sitting on a panel together, and a moderator asked Julian how it was possible he shared a stage with the woman who'd once had him thrown out of that very building. "Because Renata did something rare," Julian said. "She took real accountability, not a press release, but the slow, painful, sustained kind most people in power never even attempt." He looked at her. "That doesn't erase what happened, but it builds something new." The moderator turned to Renata, asking what she'd tell the woman she'd been a year earlier. Renata paused, and when she spoke, her voice was steady but carried everything. I'd tell her that her certainty was blinding her, she said, that she was about to harm someone because she couldn't see past her own assumptions, that it would take losing everything to finally open her eyes. She turned to Julian. And I'd tell her that no one should have to be a billionaire to be treated like a human being. That was never the lesson. That was just the only reason the world made me learn it. Here's what's worth carrying from this story after the satisfying part fades. It's easy watching a woman like Renata Wexford lose everything and feel justice has been served, satisfying seeing the powerful face consequences, watching someone who looked down on a stranger get looked down on in return. But if that's all you take from this, you've taken the shallow version, because Julian Marsh never wanted spectacle. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't destroy her. He simply walked out of a lobby and let the truth of what she'd done arrive on its own, and that truth was never really about one bad morning. It was about the 1,000 small moments never recorded, where someone decides you don't belong before you've spoken a single word, based on your clothing, your accent, the neighborhood you came from, your skin color. Renata faced reckoning only because the man she wronged happened to have power. The people she'd wronged before him, those without a billion-dollar fund, unable to fly across the country demanding meetings, simply absorbed it and went home, expected to keep absorbing it silently. That's what should stay with you. Most people never receive the apology. Most people never get the room or the sheet of paper or the second chance. So here's the actual lesson, and it isn't about cruelty in a lobby. Real power was never the empire Renata built, the corner office, the name on the building, the ability to have someone removed with a raised hand, and real leadership was never the fear she could command from a room's head. The truest measure of anyone with power is what they do for people who can offer them nothing in return, the stranger, the one in the plain shirt, the one everyone else has already decided doesn't count. You can run a company worth hundreds of millions and fail the test in 3 seconds, or you can have nothing to prove and pass it without thinking, and the difference between those two people is everything that matters. So let me ask you something before you go. When was the last time you sized someone up and decided, before they opened their mouth, exactly who they were? Have you ever walked past someone's humanity to reach a transaction? And had you been standing in that lobby, would you have shaken his hand, or would you have been Renata? Be honest. That's where change actually begins. If this story moved you, do something with it. Examine your own assumptions before they cost someone else. Treat the person who can't promote you or fund you or help you with exactly the dignity you'd extend the most important person in the room, because that's the only real test there is. Leave a comment telling me, have you ever been judged before you got to speak? Share this with someone who needs the reminder, and subscribe, because how we treat people we assume don't matter is the truest measure of who we are, and the best leaders are simply those who understood that first. Respect isn't something you earn by dressing for it.